Hi, I'm Michael from Planet Naturopath. I've made a few videos about the GI map stool test before, and in this video we're going to focus on the opportunistic bacteria section. So in each test you've got the different pathogens, parasites that are the more serious ones, and many people are negative for that, but it's actually the opportunistic bacteria that usually cause most of the problems. The test looks at Helicobacter pylori. These levels are low. It's common to have H. pylori. It's only really a problem if the levels are high, the virulence factors are positive, or if someone has lots of the H. pylori symptoms. With the keystone bacteria, the areas I look at are the ones like bifidobacterium, lactobacillus. They're both on the low side, but also fecal bacterium and roseburia. They're important butyrate producers. And in this test, the overall phyla are low. So this is overall low levels of bacteria. And then the next page looks at the opportunistic bacteria. And so there's not too many of the elevated. There's 1, 2, 3. But things like Morganella and Citrobacter can be very inflammatory. And these levels are reasonably high. 9.5 E4 is around almost 100,000 cells per gram, and it should be less than 1,000. So when you see, and the Citrobacter is also high. So when you see low levels of the beneficial bacteria and high levels of these opportunistic ones, it's important to address this, but you also want to focus on building up the good bacteria as well. And the best way to do that is with prebiotics. Whenever you look at a test though, you always look at the rest of the test. All the other pathogens like parasites and worms were clear. You look at the intestinal health markers and see what's going on. The first thing I always check is calprotectin, make sure the levels are not high. It's an inflammation marker. Make sure there's no blood. Steatica is the fat in the stool. That's good. The elastase levels are a little bit low. That's the pancreatic enzymes. But beta-glucuronidase is high. So that's a detoxification marker. It's important for detoxification of hormones, and a lot of people can be estrogen dominant because of high levels here. And everything else is okay. So the first thing I'll do is focus on building up the good bacteria, but at the same time trying to lower those opportunistic bacteria with selective herbs. Let's look at a different test. So this one here, similar sort of thing. The first page is negative for everything. There's a low level of H. pylori. It's very common. With all of the beneficial bacteria, most things are pretty good here. Bifidobacterium, lactobacillus, Akkermansia, fecal bacterium and roseburia are all good, and the phyla are okay. And now the opportunistic bacteria. So these levels are particularly high. So Pseudomonas 2.3 E5, that's E to the 5 is like an exponential marker. So that's around 230,000 cells per gram, and it should be less than 10,000 or lower than that. And Pseudomonas is a bacteria that produces a lot of lipopolysaccharides or endotoxins. So that's one that we really want to address here. And then same with the staph, that's a little bit high, and the strep's a little bit high. They can both be pro-inflammatory as well, but this main issue here is this high Pseudomonas. And then with these commensal inflammatory ones, they're a little bit high, but that's less of a problem than the Pseudomonas. And once again, we look at the other markers. Everything's negative here. This elastase is okay. There's minor amounts of blood, but that could be, you always got a quiz if someone's got hemorrhoids or something like that. In this case, the antigliadin is very high and calprotectin is very high. So calprotectin is a marker of inflammatory bowel disease, but with moderately high levels, it doesn't mean that someone has inflammatory bowel disease. You want to make sure that blood levels are low. Potentially a colonoscopy would be needed to rule this out. But in this situation, with gliadin high, what we did was eliminated gluten 100%, and all these markers and many of the symptoms just improved by going gluten-free and treating the dysbiosis. Let's have a look at another result. This one, similar sort of thing, the negative pathogens on page 1. Once again, a low level of H. pylori. And in this case, most of the beneficial bacteria are all reasonably good. And you've got high levels of Pseudomonas again. Once again, this is E6. So this is actually even higher than the last one. So E6 is around the 7 million mark rather than, so you don't look at the 7 and the 1, you look at this E6. Whenever it's 1 or 2 higher, that's many, many times the limit. They're the main ones that are elevated, but when you see such high levels, this needs to be addressed. And once again, this one here actually has some parasites present. Dientamoeba and P. hominis, we won't try and say that word. These and a low level of E. coli. It's actually quite common to have these parasites, and they don't always cause problems. Often just treating the other dysbiotic markers is enough to bring these into place. We don't necessarily need to do an anti-parasitic formula or special protocol for this. The elastase levels are low, so that's going to affect digestion and absorption of nutrients and also contribute to symptoms. Calprotectin's okay. The other ones that stand out here are the secretory immunoglobulin A is low. This can be low with long-term infections. It can also be low if someone's had a lot of stress, and that's a really common reason. When I say stress, that could be physical stress, mental stress, not sleeping enough, things like that. And then these zonulin's also elevated. So that is a intestinal permeability marker, and high levels are probably relating to those bacterial infections. So treating leaky gut's important, but maybe the first step is, or at the same time, you also want to be treating that high levels of bacteria. And one more test, we'll go up to the top. Once again, low levels of H. pylori present. Bifidobacterium's fine, lactobacillus is fine, but in this case, there's missing species here. And this can happen when someone's had a lot of antibiotic treatments in the past, and especially Akkermansia and fecal bacterium. Low levels of these, or absent levels, can be associated with things like inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis. And in this case, I know for a fact that the person had inflammatory bowel disease, and we'll look at that. With the opportunistic bacteria, there was not too much overgrown here, and methanobacteria can actually slow down motility. There was no other parasites, but with the intestinal health markers, so with inflammatory bowel disease, the first thing I'll look at is the calprotectin. And while the levels aren't optimal, they're not too bad, but being on medication can help to lower these levels down, but the high levels of blood indicate they're still getting symptoms of inflammatory bowel disease. So in a situation like this, we want to focus on the inflammation, healing of the gut, rather than trying to and building up those beneficial bacteria, rather than trying to kill those opportunistic bacteria. So each test's different, and you always have to take into account, someone's signs and symptoms, their intestinal health markers. And I would never recommend, I would never look at someone's treatment plan and recommend a treatment without knowing anything about them. So I hope that helps.